Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before we get started, just a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and share this episode. And if you're listening on a different platform, be sure to search for FMKE News on YouTube. We've got tons of great content on politics, sports, spirituality, and even research, so you won't want to miss out. All right, now, on to today's Deep Dive. You've been looking into Kenyan politics lately, and there's a lot to unpack, right? Protest promises some pretty concerning allegations. It's a complex landscape. We're diving into a recent interview with Kimani Ichung'wah, the majority leader in Kenya's National Assembly. He's a close ally of President Ruto, and he had a lot to say.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. What's striking is the sheer volume of unfulfilled promises from Ruto's 2022 election campaign. We're not just talking about minor pledges here. We're talking about key commitments that really resonated deeply with voters.
Exactly, and an independent parliamentary monitoring organization actually crunched the numbers. They found that only 14 out of 281 promises have been fulfilled so far.
14 out of 281. That's a pretty stark statistic. And when you actually delve into the specifics, it really raises questions about Ruto's priorities and the challenges his administration is facing. For example, remember the pledge to provide free internet and phone calls for young people?
Oh, yeah, that was a huge one.
Yeah, a major draw for younger voters, and it's gone unfulfilled.
Right, and what about the promise to launch an inquiry into cronyism? That was a big one, especially for those concerned about corruption within the government.
Also unfulfilled, and the same goes for ratifying the International Convention Against Enforced Disappearances. This is a crucial international treaty, aimed at preventing abductions and holding states accountable for disappearances.
You've been researching this, so, this convention carries a lot of weight internationally. It's a signal to the global community that a country takes these issues seriously. So the fact that it's still unratified speaks volumes.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is how Ichung'wah initially avoided giving a straight answer when asked about the number of fulfilled promises. He spoke about implementing the manifesto chapter by chapter. But eventually he had to concede that 14 out of 281 figure.
It's a classic case of political maneuvering. But the numbers speak for themselves. And this really set the stage for a tense interview, especially when the discussion shifted to the government's response to protests.
Right. These protests were sparked by the rising cost of living and a controversial finance bill that many saw as adding to the burden on ordinary Kenyans.
Right, and we saw these huge demonstrations across the country, but the government's reaction was brutal. There were reports of deaths, abductions, and just a really heavy-handed crackdown on protesters.
And Ichung'wah defended the government's actions, claiming that the police only intervene when demonstrations turn violent.
But a Reuters investigation uncovered evidence that police were covering up killings by recording them as accidents. They even found a case where a 19-year-old protester who was shot in the head was officially listed as a victim of a road accident.
It's a chilling example of how authorities may be attempting to obscure the true extent of the violence used against protesters. And it's not just Reuters. Human Rights Watch also reported that bodies were turning up in rivers and forests, showing signs of torture.
It's a deeply disturbing situation, especially given that these reports are coming from reputable international organizations.
And to make matters worse, Ichung'wah made some incredibly dismissive comments about the abductions, even suggesting that some victims might be faking their disappearances.
Given the gravity of the situation and the fear that these abductions have generated, to suggest that people might be gaming the system is incredibly insensitive. But there's one case that really throws a wrench into that theory: the abduction of the former Attorney General's son.
Oh, wow.
That's right. And according to reports, it took a direct appeal from the former Attorney General to President Ruto himself to secure his son's release.
So if these abductions are not state-sponsored, as Ichung'wah claims, then how do you explain the president's direct involvement in securing someone's release? It just doesn't add up.
It raises serious questions about who's behind these abductions and why the government is so reluctant to acknowledge them. Which leads us to another major issue plaguing Kenya: corruption.
Yeah.
Corruption has been a persistent problem in Kenya, and unfortunately, it seems that the Ruto administration hasn't been immune to these challenges. In fact, President Ruto himself was named one of the most corrupt leaders in the world by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
That's a pretty damning indictment.
It is, and while Ichung'wah tried to defend the government's record on corruption, pointing to the digitization of government services, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Kenya actually dropped 3 places on Transparency International's corruption index, which isn't exactly a sign of progress.
Right.
And if that wasn't enough, a 2024 U.S. government report stated that American companies doing business in Kenya routinely report facing bribe requests from officials at all levels of government.
So we have international organizations, independent monitors, and even foreign governments flagging serious concerns about corruption in Kenya. Yet, Ichung'wah maintains that it's all a matter of perception.
Yeah, it's tough to square that circle,
It's difficult to reconcile that with the evidence, especially when you consider the stark contrast between President Ruto's hustler image and his vast wealth. He presents himself as this man of the people, someone who understands the struggles of ordinary Kenyans. But his assets tell a different story. We're talking luxury hotels, a massive farm, a poultry plant.
This is where the disconnect between the government and the people you know becomes even more apparent. Many Kenyans see Ruto's wealth, coupled with the lavish lifestyles of other politicians, as a slap in the face, especially when you consider that Kenyan MPs are among the highest paid in the world. And they're not exactly shy about flaunting it. You see the expensive cars, the extravagant homes all over social media. It creates a perception that the political elite are living in a bubble, detached from the realities of everyday Kenyans who are struggling to make ends meet.
The audience in London really picked up on this point, expressing frustration at politicians who seem more concerned with their online image than addressing real issues like femicide, corruption, and the rising cost of living.
It's like they're living in a parallel universe obsessed with social media clout, while the country grapples with these serious problems. And speaking serious problems, let's talk about the allegations of police brutality and extrajudicial killings. Ichung'wah insisted that the Kenyan Constitution is robust and that the police are held accountable for their actions. But does that align with what we're seeing?
Well, he claims that investigations were ongoing and that some police officers were being prosecuted, but Amnesty International and other human rights groups have documented a concerning pattern of impunity. Security forces appear to be acting with very little fear of consequences.
Again, we go back to the case of the former Attorney General's son. If these abductions weren't state-sponsored, why would the president himself need to intervene to secure his release? It just doesn't add up.
Yeah, it suggests a very disturbing possibility that those in power are operating outside the law without accountability. Ichung'wah also attempted to downplay the international criticism, brushing it off as a matter of perception. But how do you explain away a U.S. government report explicitly stating that American companies routinely face bribe requests from Kenyan officials?
Exactly. It's not just perception, it's the lived experience of people trying to do business in Kenya. When you have multiple sources, international organizations, independent monitors, foreign governments, all highlighting the same problems, it's impossible to dismiss it as mere perception.
It points to a very deep-seated culture of corruption that permeates all levels of government, and it's eroding public trust and hindering Kenya's development. The interview also touched upon a potential avenue for accountability, the ICC.
This is interesting because President Ruto himself was indicted by the ICC for crimes against humanity related to the 2007 post-election violence. Although the case was eventually dropped, it raises questions about the potential for the ICC to play a role in addressing current human rights concerns.
Well, Irungu Houghton from Amnesty International warned that if Kenyan courts continue to fail to deliver justice, there will be growing calls for international intervention.
Predictably, Ichung'wah dismissed this possibility, emphasizing the importance of strengthening domestic institutions. But what happens when those institutions are themselves part of the problem?
It's a dilemma many countries face when grappling with human rights abuses and corruption. When domestic remedies fail, what recourse do citizens have?
The interview with Kimani Ichung'wah, while controversial, offered some valuable insights into the complexities of Kenyan politics.
It exposed the contradictions, the unfulfilled promises, and the deeply entrenched challenges facing the country.
The audience's pointed questions and the experts' contributions really enriched the conversation, shedding light on the anxieties, frustrations, and hopes of Kenyans.
Yeah, this is a conversation that needs to continue.
Absolutely, and it's a conversation that all Kenyans, regardless of their political affiliations, need to be a part of the future of Kenya. Hinges on it now. Before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and share it with your friends. And if you're enjoying this content, make sure to search for FMKE News on YouTube for more insightful content. We've got you covered on everything from politics and sports to spirituality and research. As we wrap up our deep dive into Kenyan politics, it's clear the country is at a crossroads. We've got a government wrestling with this crisis of trust, fueled by unmet promises, allegations of corruption and brutality, and just a widening chasm between the political elite and the people they're supposed to represent.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember that this isn't just some abstract political drama. These issues have real-world consequences for everyday Kenyans. We've discussed the rising cost of living, the violent suppression of protests, the abductions, and the disappearances. These are people's lives, their families, their futures hanging in the balance.
What struck me throughout this interview, especially listening to the audience in London, was the palpable frustration and disillusionment. These were members of the Kenyan diaspora, many likely still deeply connected to their homeland. Their questions weren't academic. They were deeply personal, reflecting a yearning for better governance, for a fairer society.
Yeah, they weren't afraid to hold Ichung'wa accountable, challenging his claims, pushing back on his justifications, and demanding transparency. It was a powerful reminder that citizens have a right, even a duty, to question their leaders and demand better.
This deep dive has brought some uncomfortable truths about Kenyan politics to light, but it's also ignited a crucial conversation about the path forward. So, where does Kenya go from here? What can be done?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there are no simple solutions, but acknowledging the depth of the problems is a critical first step. The government can't keep dismissing these issues as mere perception or blaming external forces. They need genuine dialogue with the Kenyan people to truly listen to their concerns and take concrete steps to address them.
That means tackling corruption head on, ensuring accountability for human rights violations, and delivering on those promises made to the electorate.
It also means creating a more inclusive and equitable society where the benefits of economic growth are shared more broadly, not just concentrated among the elite.
And what about the role of the international community? We've touched upon the potential for the ICC to get involved, and there's constant pressure from international organizations and foreign governments to see improvements in governance and human rights. What responsibility do these external actors have, especially when domestic institutions fail to deliver justice?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's a conversation worth having. What we've done today is give you a starting point. We've provided information analysis and hopefully some food for thought. Now it's your turn to go further.
It's to help adherents. Exactly. Do your own research. Dig deeper into these issues and form your own opinions. Engage in conversations with your friends, family, and your community. Share what you've learned, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. The future of Kenya depends on active, informed citizens who demand better from their leaders. We've taken a deep dive together. Now it's your turn to explore further. What stood out to you? What would you do with this knowledge? We always love having you here on Deep Dive. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this episode with your friends. And if you're hungry for more insightful discussions, head over to FMKE News. On YouTube, we cover everything from politics and sports to spirituality and research. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.